In this lesson, we're going to discuss some of the things you can do to increase the security of your workstation using settings found in the BIOS or within your UEFI configuration. The first thing we're going to look at is the use of passwords to protect the system. Most motherboard manufacturers allow you to set one or more system passwords in either the BIOS or UEFI depending upon what your system uses. For example, some systems allow you to set a user password. The user password is required to boot the system. When a user password is configured, you'll be prompted to enter that password before the system is allowed to start up. This is a good security measure because it prevents someone who's not authorized from being able to boot the system. In addition to a user password, most manufacturers also allow you to configure an administrator password. The administrator password is required if you want to make changes within the BIOS configuration or the UEFI configuration. For example, to make a change to a setting, you have to first supply the administrator password. Using a user password in conjunction with an administrator password increases the overall security of your workstation system. However, be aware that these passwords are not perfect. For example, on older BIOS-based systems, the passwords can usually be cleared rather easily. On the motherboard of most of these computers, you'll find a set of jumpers composed of 3 pins called the CMOS clear jumper block. By default, a jumper is placed over 2 of the 3 pins. Exactly which set of pins depends upon the motherboard manufacturer. Understand that in this configuration, the BIOS and the CMOS operate normally because the jumper configuration allows power from the CMOS battery to reach the CMOS chip. If you were to take this jumper off from these pins and move it to the other set of pins, you remove power from the CMOS chip. The CMOS chip requires power at all times to retain its contents. When you remove battery power, the contents of the CMOS are cleared, including the user and administrator passwords. Using this technique, a determined attacker could get around any passwords you may have implemented in the BIOS. UEFI-based systems do fare a little better where this is concerned. Removing power from a UEFI motherboard will typically not reset any system passwords that you may have configured. Now, another security feature that you can choose to implement is setting a hard disk password. This is sometimes called drive locking. If you do this, then you will have to enter the drive password in order to boot the system. Drive locking prevents access to the hard drive unless the user knows the appropriate password that you configured. The drive locking password is unlike the passwords we just talked about that are saved on a chip on the motherboard. Instead, the drive locking password is encrypted and saved on the hard drive itself. This has a lot of benefits. For example, it keeps that password from being removed if there is a CMOS reset using the jumpers we just talked about. A CMOS reset won't affect a drive-locked hard disk drive. You can also increase the security of a locked drive if your motherboard includes a Trusted Platform Module, TPM. TPM is a chip that's integrated on the motherboard that provides cryptographic services. If you lock a drive using the TPM, then a recovery password is required to take that drive from the computer and move it to a different computer. Moving drives to another computer is a common technique attackers use to try to defeat your standard file system ACLs that are designed to block access. TPM can do this because it provides full support for asymmetric encryption. As such, it can generate both public and private keys. In fact, full disk encryption applications like Windows BitLocker can use TPM technology to protect the keys that are used to encrypt that computer's hard disk drive. In addition to using BitLocker, some systems provide an option to encrypt the entire hard disk drive in the BIOS or UEFI implementation, depending on what your motherboard uses. It does this without using any installed software at all, like BitLocker. To do this, you first set up your user and your administrator password, like we talked about earlier. Then you create a security key that you use to encrypt the contents of the hard disk drive. If you do this, be sure you export that key to an external USB drive in case you need to recover it later. The contents of the hard drive are encrypted using that key. From that point on, the key is required to read the contents of the drive. If you don't have that key, you can't decrypt the information on the drive. Another security feature implemented in some systems is called LoJack. It's an effective way to secure systems that are prone to being stolen, like a notebook system. The LoJack software is implemented within a chip on the motherboard. You can use it to locate and recover a stolen system. After it is installed, the LoJack software periodically contacts a LoJack server at the vendor's website, and it does 2 things. First, it uses GPS coordinates to report the system's current location to that server. The second thing it does is query the server at LoJack headquarters to see if that system's been reported as stolen. LoJack will continuously update the server with the system's current location. This makes it easier for law enforcement to figure out who has it and where it is if it's been stolen. The software that performs these two tasks is not implemented on the motherboard chip. The software contained in the motherboard chip is just a downloader that pulls down and installs the LoJack software as a Windows service. Most of the security features we've discussed in this lesson so far are available in both BIOS and UEFI-based systems. However, newer UEFI-based systems also include many other valuable security features that aren't usually available on BIOS-based systems. First of all, understand that UEFI requires firmware updates to be digitally signed by the hardware vendor. One of the weaknesses associated with a traditional BIOS is the fact that hackers could potentially tamper with BIOS firmware updates. They could do a variety of things to tamper with it. They could, for example, introduce malware into the system. They could even play with the code so that when you install the firmware update, it breaks the whole system, making it unusable. Because UEFI uses digital signatures, any unauthorized changes to the firmware can be easily detected because the digital signature won't match. UEFI also provides a security feature called Secure Boot. This is very useful. Secure Boot requires the operating system installed on the system hard disk drive to also be digitally signed. By default, if it isn't digitally signed, then the UEFI firmware will not boot it. Secure Boot is designed for a very specific reason. It's intended to block a special type of malware called a rootkit. A rootkit inserts itself into the boot sector of a storage device, which causes it to be loaded first. Then the rootkit loads the real operating system. By doing this, the rootkit gets loaded before any anti-malware software gets loaded. Therefore, it's very difficult to detect the presence of the rootkit malware on the system. Secure Boot also prevents the booting of unauthorized operating systems. For example, it prevents the system from booting an operating system installed on a removable USB drive or optical disk. Such an operating system could be used to then access the data on the system hard disk drive. That's it for this lesson. In this lesson, we reviewed several features that you can implement within the BIOS or the UEFI implementation on your motherboard to increase the overall security of the system. We first look at setting up user and administrator passwords. We talked about using a drive password. We talked about using TPM to further secure the drive password. We talked about using full disk encryption and about using LoJack. We ended this lesson by discussing UEFI-specific security features.